Have you ever walked into a room and felt completely invisible? Like people looked right through you as if you didn't matter at all? My name is Sarah Mitchell. I'm 32 years old, and I know exactly what that feels like. But what I'm about to tell you will show you that sometimes the person everyone ignores might just be the most powerful one in the room. You see, there was this one moment in a courtroom when everything changed, and the look of pure shock on everyone's faces still gives me chills. If you've ever felt underestimated or overlooked, please hit that subscribe button and give this video a like, because what happened to me might just inspire you to see your own hidden strength. Have you ever had someone completely misjudge who you really are? Let me know in the comments because I want to hear your stories too. Picture this: a packed courtroom, the kind you see in movies with wooden benches and that heavy, serious atmosphere. I was sitting in the back corner, dressed in simple clothes, looking like just another face in the crowd. My ex-husband Marcus was at the front with his expensive lawyer, Mr. Davidson, both of them wearing those confident smirks that said they'd already won. The divorce proceedings had been brutal, and they thought they had me cornered, ready to take everything I'd worked for. But here's the thing about being underestimated. It gives you a special kind of power that nobody sees coming. Marcus had spent months telling everyone how I was just a simple housewife who didn't understand business or money. His lawyer treated me like I was some naive woman who would crumble under pressure. Even the judge seemed to barely notice me when I walked in, probably thinking I was just another routine case. What they didn't know was that I'd been preparing for this moment in ways they could never imagine. You won't believe what happened next, but I need you to understand something first. This isn't just about revenge or getting back at someone who wronged me. This story is about the moment when you realize that your true identity, the person you really are beneath all the assumptions people make, can change everything in an instant. The power was always there, waiting for the right moment to be revealed, and that courtroom was about to become the stage for the biggest surprise of their lives. For 12 years, I lived what most people would call a comfortable life, but comfort can sometimes be the most dangerous prison of all. Marcus and I met in college. He was studying business, and I was working on my degree in computer science, though I never got to finish it. We got married young, and like so many women, I put my dreams on hold to support his career and raise our two kids, Emma and Jake. I became the perfect wife on paper, organizing his business dinners, managing the household, and making sure everything ran smoothly while he climbed the corporate ladder. But if you're watching this and you've ever felt like you lost yourself in someone else's dreams, please subscribe and hit that like button. Your story matters just as much as mine does. Have you ever wondered what might have happened if you'd chosen a different path? Sometimes I think about all of us who gave up pieces of ourselves, and I want you to know that it's never too late to reclaim who you really are. The thing about sacrifice is that people start to take it for granted, like it's just what you're supposed to do. Marcus began treating my contributions to our life as invisible. The way I managed everything so he could focus on work, how I networked with other business wives to help his career, even the financial advice I gave him that he'd later claim as his own brilliant ideas. It was like being a ghost in my own life, watching someone else get credit for the foundation I'd helped build. My kids saw it too, though they were too young to fully understand why Mommy seemed so sad sometimes. I remember one evening when Marcus came home and announced he'd gotten a huge promotion, one that was directly linked to a business strategy I'd suggested months earlier. But when I mentioned it, he just laughed and said, "Come on, Sarah, let the adults handle the business stuff." That night, lying in bed while he celebrated his success, I felt something shift inside me. It wasn't anger exactly. It was more like a door closing on one version of myself and another one slowly starting to open. What I didn't tell anyone, not even my closest friends, was that during all those years of feeling invisible, I'd been quietly building something of my own. Late at night, after everyone was asleep, I'd been working on projects that Marcus would have called silly hobbies if he'd known about them. But those hobbies were about to become the key to everything. And the person sitting in that courtroom corner wasn't just a forgotten housewife. She was someone with secrets that would change everything. The years of giving everything while receiving so little in return had taught me something valuable about resilience, though I didn't realize it at the time. Every morning I'd wake up at 5 a.m. to prepare Marcus's breakfast and pack his lunch, then get the kids ready for school while he stayed in bed until the last possible moment. I'd handle the grocery shopping, the house maintenance, the kids' homework help, and still find time to research investment opportunities that Marcus would present to his colleagues as his own discoveries. It felt like I was running a small company, except no one saw me as the CEO. They saw me as the unpaid assistant. But here's what I learned. When you're used to doing everything behind the scenes, you become really good at seeing the big picture that others miss. The hardest part wasn't the workload. It was watching my own dreams fade away like old photographs left in the sun. I used to love solving complex problems, creating systems that worked efficiently, and finding innovative solutions to challenges. Before marriage, I'd been the person my classmates came to when their computer programs wouldn't work, the one who could debug code that had stumped everyone else. Now, my biggest intellectual challenge was figuring out how to stretch the grocery budget while Marcus spent hundreds on business lunches. I felt like I had this brilliant mind that was slowly being covered in dust, waiting for someone to notice it was still there. Marcus began treating our home like a hotel where everything magically happened without any effort from him. When clients came over for dinner, I'd spend days planning the perfect menu, decorating the house, and creating an atmosphere that would impress his business partners. He'd take all the credit for our hospitality and attention to detail, never mentioning that I'd been the one orchestrating everything from behind the scenes. One evening, after a particularly successful dinner party that led to a major contract for his company, I overheard him telling his friend that he'd really outdone himself with the presentation. I was standing right there, still wearing the apron I'd had on all evening while serving their drinks. The children began to notice the imbalance too, though they expressed it in ways that broke my heart. Emma, who was 8 at the time, once asked me why Daddy got to rest after work while I never seemed to stop working. Jake, only 6, started copying Marcus's dismissive attitude toward me, rolling his eyes when I'd suggest something or interrupt me mid-sentence just like his father did. I realized I wasn't just losing myself in this marriage. I was teaching my children that this was how relationships were supposed to work. That night, I made a promise to myself that I would find a way to show them what real strength looked like, even if I didn't know how yet. But the universe has a funny way of preparing you for battles you don't even know you're going to fight. All those years of managing complex schedules, solving family crises, and juggling multiple responsibilities had been training me for something bigger. Every night spent researching Marcus's business problems had taught me about corporate law, financial structures, and market analysis. Every budget I'd stretched and every problem I'd solved in silence had been building a skill set that I didn't even realize I possessed. I was becoming someone powerful, even while everyone around me was treating me like I was powerless. The moment I realized my marriage was truly over came on a Tuesday evening that started like any other ordinary day, but ended with me feeling more alone than I'd ever felt in my entire life. Marcus walked through the door with a look I'd never seen before. Not anger, not frustration, but something much worse. Complete indifference. He sat down at our kitchen table, the same one where we'd shared thousands of meals and made countless plans for our future, and told me he wanted a divorce. But it wasn't the divorce request that shattered my heart. It was the cold, business-like way he delivered it, as if I was an employee being let go rather than the woman who'd given him the best 12 years of her life. If you've ever experienced that moment when someone you love looks at you like you're a stranger, please subscribe and give this video a like, because I know how isolating that feeling can be. Have you ever felt like you gave everything to someone who saw you as easily replaceable? I want you to know that your worth isn't determined by how others treat you, and I hope my story helps you remember that. What hurt even more than his decision was discovering that he'd already made plans for his new life without even discussing our problems or trying to work things out. He'd consulted with divorce lawyers weeks before telling me, had already looked at apartments, and worst of all, had told his colleagues and friends before telling his own wife. I felt like everyone else had known my marriage was ending before I did. Marcus explained it all so matter-of-factly. He'd met someone at work, someone who understood his ambitions, and didn't drag him down with domestic concerns. The way he said it made it sound like caring about our family and our home was some kind of character flaw on my part. The conversation that followed was like watching 12 years of my life get erased in real time. He talked about dividing assets as if our memories were just items on a spreadsheet, discussed custody arrangements like the kids were business obligations to be managed efficiently. When I tried to remind him of all the ways I'd supported his career, all the sacrifices I'd made so he could achieve his dreams, he just shrugged and said, "That's what marriage was supposed to be about back then." As if my contributions had expired along with his feelings for me. The man I'd loved was sitting right there, but it felt like I was talking to a complete stranger wearing his face. That night, after he'd gone to stay at his brother's house, I sat in our empty bedroom and felt something I'd never experienced before. Not just heartbreak, but a deep, burning realization that I'd been living as half a person for over a decade. I'd become so focused on supporting someone else's dreams that I'd forgotten I had my own power, my own intelligence, my own capacity for greatness. The woman who'd once debugged complex computer programs and solved problems that stumped her professors was still inside me, buried under years of being told that her ideas didn't matter. But that woman was about to wake up, and she was going to remind everyone, especially Marcus, exactly who they'd been underestimating all along. The weeks following Marcus's announcement were like living in a fog where everything felt surreal and disconnected from reality. I went through the motions of daily life, making breakfast for Emma and Jake, helping with homework, doing laundry, but inside, something fundamental was changing. It started as a whisper in the back of my mind during those quiet moments when the kids were at school and the house felt empty. The whisper kept saying the same thing over and over: "You don't have to accept this." At first, I tried to ignore it because accepting seemed easier than fighting, but that whisper grew louder each day until it became impossible to silence. If you've ever reached that moment where you realized you deserved better treatment, please hit the subscribe button and like this video, because sometimes we all need reminders that we're stronger than we think. Have you ever felt like you were at a crossroads where you had to choose between staying small or stepping into your power? I'd love to hear about your moment of decision in the comments. The turning point came when I was helping Jake with his math homework, and he asked me a question that stopped me cold. "Mom, why do you always let Daddy make all the decisions?" This 8-year-old had noticed what I'd been trying to pretend wasn't happening, that I'd become someone who automatically deferred to Marcus's judgment on everything, even though my ideas were often better than his. I realized that my children were learning from my example, and if I continued to accept being treated as less than equal, I'd be teaching them that this was normal. That night, I looked at myself in the bathroom mirror and made a promise. I was going to show my kids what it looked like when someone stands up for themselves. Marcus had made a critical mistake in how he approached the divorce. He assumed I'd be so devastated and helpless that I'd agree to whatever settlement his lawyer proposed. His attorney, Mr. Davidson, had already sent me papers suggesting I'd get basic alimony and limited custody, as if I was just some dependent who needed to be managed, rather than an equal partner who'd contributed to building our life together. They were counting on me being too emotional, too overwhelmed, and too intimidated by the legal process to put up any real fight. What they didn't realize was that years of being underestimated had taught me how to observe, analyze, and plan while everyone else assumed I wasn't paying attention. I spent the next few days in a state that I can only describe as strategic awakening, like a computer that had been running on sleep mode suddenly powering up to full capacity. Every conversation I'd had with Marcus about his business deals, every financial document I'd filed away, every networking event where I'd smiled politely while mentally noting important details, all of it started forming a picture that even I hadn't seen clearly before. I wasn't just the wife who got left behind. I was someone who'd been quietly accumulating knowledge, connections, and insights that could change everything. But I knew that if I was going to fight back, I needed to be smarter about it than Marcus expected, because the element of surprise was going to be my greatest weapon. What Marcus never knew, what nobody in our social circle had any idea about, was that during all those late nights when everyone thought I was just doing household administrative work, I'd been building something extraordinary. Remember how I mentioned that I never finished my computer science degree? Well, I never stopped learning about technology, and over the years I'd been quietly developing software solutions for small businesses in our community. It started as a favor for our neighbor who owned a bakery and needed help organizing her inventory system. Word spread, and soon I had a small but steady stream of clients who paid me to solve their technical problems. I'd been doing it all under a business name that wasn't connected to our family, keeping the income in a separate account that Marcus didn't know existed. The work had started as something to keep my mind sharp, but it had grown into something much more significant than I'd ever imagined. I'd created customer management systems for 3 local restaurants, designed a scheduling application for a medical practice, and even built an e-commerce platform for a boutique clothing store. Each project had taught me something new about business operations, client relations, and market needs. More importantly, it had connected me with a network of small business owners who respected my expertise and saw me as a problem solver rather than just someone's wife. These people knew me as Sarah the consultant, not Sarah the housewife, and their confidence in my abilities had been quietly rebuilding my sense of professional identity. But the real secret weapon wasn't just my technical skills or my growing client base. It was what I'd learned about Marcus's business during all those years of domestic conversations. When you're married to someone, they tell you things they'd never discuss with colleagues or competitors. I knew about his company's vulnerabilities, their upcoming mergers, the clients they were desperate to keep, and the mistakes they'd made that could potentially become legal problems. Marcus had always talked about work at home because he saw me as a safe, non-threatening audience who wouldn't understand the implications of what he was sharing. He had no idea that I'd been mentally cataloging every piece of information, not because I planned to use it, but because my analytical mind couldn't help but process and store data. The moment I decided to fight the divorce terms, all of this hidden knowledge started connecting in ways that even surprised me. I realized that I wasn't just someone who'd been supporting Marcus's career from the sidelines. I'd been an uncredited consultant whose insights had contributed to several of his major successes. The investment strategies I'd suggested, the client relationships I'd helped nurture through social connections, even the cost-saving measures I'd recommended, all of it had tangible value that could be quantified and legally recognized. I started documenting everything I could remember, every contribution I'd made that had been absorbed into Marcus's professional achievements without acknowledgement. For the first time in years, I felt like I was seeing myself clearly, not as the diminished version that Marcus had trained me to accept, but as the capable, intelligent woman I'd always been underneath all the assumptions and limitations. The person sitting in that courtroom wasn't going to be the helpless housewife that everyone expected. She was going to be someone who understood the law, had done her research, knew her rights, and had capabilities that would shock everyone in that room. I was about to show them all that the most dangerous opponent is the one you never saw coming, and I'd been preparing for this battle longer than anyone realized. The day of the hearing arrived with that crisp October morning air that makes everything feel more dramatic than usual. I walked into the courthouse wearing a simple navy dress and carrying a basic leather briefcase that Marcus had given me years ago for important documents, though he'd never imagined I'd use it for something like this. The marble floors echoed with each step as I made my way to courtroom 304, and I could feel my heart pounding not from fear, but from anticipation. Marcus was already seated at the plaintiff's table with Mr. Davidson, both of them looking confident and relaxed, probably discussing their weekend golf plans or celebrating their expected easy victory. They glanced at me when I entered, and I saw that familiar look of dismissive pity, as if they were dealing with a child who didn't understand how serious this all was. If you've ever walked into a situation where everyone underestimated you, please subscribe and hit that like button, because what happens next might inspire you to trust your own hidden strength. Have you ever had a moment where you knew you were about to surprise everyone around you? I want to hear about your experiences in the comments below. I took my seat at the defendant's table, opened my briefcase with deliberate calm, and began organizing my documents while the judge, Honorable Patricia Williams, reviewed the initial filings. The courtroom had that heavy, serious atmosphere you see in legal dramas, but what struck me most was how everyone seemed to be going through the motions of a routine case. Marcus's lawyer was shuffling through papers with casual confidence, the court reporter was setting up her equipment without any sense of urgency, and even the judge appeared to be treating this as just another straightforward divorce proceeding. Nobody in that room had any idea that they were about to witness something that would change their perception of what a simple housewife could accomplish when she finally decided to reveal who she really was. The proceedings began exactly as I'd expected, with Mr. Davidson presenting their case in that smooth, condescending tone that expensive lawyers use when they think they're dealing with an amateur. He painted a picture of me as the dependent spouse who'd lived a comfortable life thanks to Marcus's hard work and business success. Someone who deserved basic support but certainly not an equal share of assets or significant custody rights. He spoke about Marcus's substantial contributions to the marriage, and my role as someone who'd benefited from his entrepreneurial success, without acknowledging any real partnership. Every word was carefully chosen to make me sound like a passive recipient of Marcus's generosity, rather than an active contributor to our shared life. And I could see the judge nodding along with this narrative, as if it all made perfect sense. But then it was my turn to respond. And this is where everything changed in a way that I still get chills thinking about. I stood up slowly, walked to the center of the courtroom, and said the words that would transform that entire room. Your Honor, before we proceed with the asset division, I think it's important for everyone here to understand exactly who they're dealing with. The judge looked up from her papers with mild curiosity. Marcus shifted uncomfortably in his chair, and Mr. Davidson raised an eyebrow as if he was wondering what amateur theatrics I was about to attempt. None of them were prepared for what I said next, and the moment those words left my mouth, you could have heard a pin drop in that courtroom. My name is Sarah Mitchell, but in the business community, you might know me better as SM Consulting Solutions. I watched as the judge's expression shifted from polite attention to genuine surprise, because SM Consulting had a reputation in our city that extended far beyond what anyone in that room had realized. The judge herself had probably seen my company's name on legal documents for several high-profile business disputes where my technical analysis had been crucial to case outcomes. Mr. Davidson's confident posture crumbled as he frantically started flipping through his notes, clearly trying to figure out how he'd missed such an important detail about his opponent. Marcus's face went through a series of expressions that I'd never seen before. Confusion, then recognition, then something that looked like panic as he began to understand the implications of what I'd just revealed. What happened next was like watching a room full of people realize they'd been playing chess with someone they thought didn't even know the rules. The judge leaned forward and asked me to clarify my business credentials, and I calmly explained that for the past 6 years, I'd been running a consulting firm that specialized in business systems analysis and technical problem solving. I'd worked with over 40 local businesses, had contracts with 3 major regional companies, and maintained a client list that included some of the most successful entrepreneurs in our area. My annual income from consulting work had grown to match Marcus's salary, but I'd kept it separate from our joint finances because I'd wanted to maintain some independence and prove to myself that I could succeed on my own merits. Marcus looked like he'd seen a ghost, because suddenly all those late-night computer projects and weekend errands made perfect sense to him in a way that was probably terrifying. All those times he'd dismissed my suggestions or talked over me during business conversations, I'd been quietly building expertise that rivaled his own. The investment advice he'd taken credit for had come from my research and analysis skills. The networking connections that had benefited his career had been facilitated by relationships I'd built through my own professional work. He was realizing that the woman he'd been treating as intellectually inferior had actually been his secret weapon all along, and now she was sitting across from him in a courtroom as his adversary. Mr. Davidson tried to recover by suggesting that my business activities were just a side hobby that didn't constitute real professional achievement, but the judge interrupted him with a question that changed everything. Ms. Mitchell, isn't SM consulting the company that provided the technical analysis for the Henderson Industries merger case last year? When I confirmed that yes, that had been one of our major projects, you could see the exact moment when everyone realized they weren't dealing with an amateur. The Henderson case had been front-page news in our local business journal, involving millions of dollars in some of the city's most prominent lawyers, and my analysis had been instrumental in determining the final settlement terms. The courtroom atmosphere shifted so dramatically that it felt like we'd moved into an entirely different legal proceeding. Suddenly, I wasn't the pitied housewife seeking basic support. I was a business professional with demonstrable expertise, financial independence, and professional credentials that demanded respect. Marcus whispered something urgent to his lawyer, probably trying to figure out how to adjust their strategy, now that their fundamental assumptions about me had been completely destroyed. But it was too late for damage control, because I'd spent months preparing for this moment, and I was just getting started with the revelations that would reshape everyone's understanding of who held the real power in this relationship. The silence that followed my revelation lasted only seconds, but it felt like an eternity where you could watch people's entire perception of reality shift in real time. Marcus's face had gone pale, and he kept looking between me and his lawyer as if one of them could somehow explain how his simple housewife had been living a double life as a successful business consultant. Mr. Davidson was frantically scribbling notes and whispering urgent questions to his client, clearly realizing that their entire legal strategy had been built on false assumptions about my capabilities and financial status. The court reporter had even stopped typing for a moment, looking up with the kind of fascination you see when someone witnesses something they've never encountered before in their professional experience. Judge Williams, to her credit, maintained her professional composure, but I could see the wheels turning as she processed this new information and its implications for the case. She asked me to provide documentation of my business credentials, which I'd anticipated and prepared for extensively. I handed over my business license, tax returns showing 6 years of consulting income, client testimonials, and contracts for major projects that demonstrated both my professional reputation and financial independence. Each document I presented seemed to hit Marcus like a physical blow, because he was seeing concrete proof of a life I'd been living parallel to our marriage, a life where I was respected, valued, and compensated appropriately for my intelligence and expertise. What fascinated me most was watching how differently people treated me once they understood who I really was professionally. The bailiff, who'd barely glanced at me when I entered, now looked at me with obvious respect and curiosity. The judge began addressing me with the same tone she used for established attorneys, rather than the slightly patronizing voice she'd used initially. Even the court stenographer seemed more attentive, as if she sensed she was recording something more significant than a routine divorce proceeding. It was like watching a magic trick in reverse. Instead of making something disappear, I was making my true self visible to people who'd only seen the surface version. Marcus finally found his voice and demanded to know why I'd never told him about my business success, and his tone carried that familiar mixture of anger and entitlement that I'd grown so tired of hearing. But this time, instead of shrinking back or apologizing, I looked him directly in the eye and explained that I'd tried to share my professional achievements with him many times over the years, but he'd consistently dismissed them as unimportant hobbies that weren't worth serious discussion. I reminded him of specific conversations where I'd attempted to discuss my projects and he'd changed the subject or made condescending comments about me playing Office on the computer. The judge listened to this exchange with growing understanding, clearly recognizing the dynamic that had been operating in our marriage. Mr. Davidson tried one last desperate strategy, suggesting that my undisclosed income constituted financial deception that should work against me in the settlement, but the judge shut that down immediately. She pointed out that maintaining separate business finances was completely legal and actually demonstrated financial responsibility rather than deception. Moreover, the fact that I'd been supporting our household expenses while building a successful business showed resourcefulness and contribution to the marriage that hadn't been properly acknowledged. You could see Marcus realizing that not only had he lost the advantage he thought he had, but that I might actually be in a stronger position than he was, both financially and legally. This was the moment when I realized that what I was fighting wasn't just a divorce settlement. It was years of systematic manipulation that had convinced me I was less capable, less valuable, and less deserving of respect than I actually was. Every time Marcus had interrupted me during conversations, dismissed my ideas, or made decisions without consulting me, he'd been training me to accept a diminished version of myself. Standing in that courtroom, presenting evidence of my professional success to people who were seeing me clearly for the first time, I understood that I wasn't just advocating for a fair financial settlement. I was reclaiming my right to be recognized for who I truly was. The woman who'd been hiding in plain sight for over a decade was finally stepping into the light, and she had documentation to prove her worth. If you've ever felt like someone was trying to convince you that you were smaller than you really are, please subscribe and hit that like button, because sometimes we need to fight not just for what we deserve, but for the right to be seen as our full selves. Have you ever had to prove your worth to people who should have already known it? Share your experiences in the comments, because these stories of standing up to manipulation need to be heard. The legal battle that followed was unlike anything I'd experienced before, but I was prepared in ways that surprised even me. For months leading up to this hearing, I'd been gathering evidence not just of my financial contributions, but of the emotional and professional manipulation that had shaped our marriage dynamic. I had emails where Marcus had taken credit for my ideas in communications with his colleagues, bank records showing how my consulting income had paid for family expenses that he'd later claimed as his own financial responsibility, and testimonials from business associates who could verify my professional contributions to projects that had benefited his career. Each piece of evidence painted a picture of a partnership where one person had been getting credit for two people's work. Marcus and his lawyer tried to argue that my business success was somehow irrelevant to our marriage, that I'd been living a separate life that didn't contribute to our family's well-being. But I was ready for this argument with documentation that showed exactly how my consulting work had enhanced our lifestyle and supported our children's opportunities. The private school tuition that Marcus claimed he'd been paying alone, my business income had covered 60% of it. The family vacations he took credit for funding, I'd earned the money for those trips through client projects he'd never bothered to ask about. The house renovations that had impressed his business partners during those dinner parties, I'd not only designed the improvements myself, but had also paid for them through my consulting contracts. What became clear during the testimony was that Marcus hadn't just failed to recognize my contributions, he'd actively worked to minimize them in his own mind, and in how he presented our life to others. This wasn't simple neglect or oversight. It was a deliberate pattern of taking credit for shared successes while making me responsible for any problems or limitations. He'd convinced himself, and tried to convince everyone else, that he was the sole provider and decision-maker in our family, even though the financial records clearly showed that we'd been equal contributors for years. The judge began asking pointed questions about this discrepancy, and I could see her growing frustration with the way I'd been systematically erased from the narrative of my own life. By the end of that day's testimony, the entire tone of the proceedings had shifted from a routine divorce case to something much more significant, a reckoning with years of inequality that had been disguised as a traditional marriage. I walked out of that courtroom feeling something I hadn't experienced in over a decade, the satisfaction of being truly seen and acknowledged for my actual capabilities and contributions. Marcus left looking shell-shocked, probably beginning to understand that he'd not only underestimated his wife, but had lost the person who'd been secretly powering much of his success all along. The next phase of our legal battle was going to be very different from what he'd expected, because now everyone involved understood exactly who they were dealing with. As the weeks between court hearings passed, I found myself thinking about all the moments when things could have been different, all the opportunities that had been lost because of assumptions and misunderstandings about who I really was. There had been countless times when Marcus could have seen my capabilities if he'd just paid attention, moments when our marriage could have become a true partnership instead of this strange arrangement where I was simultaneously essential and invisible. I remembered the evening 3 years ago when his company was struggling with a major software integration problem that was costing them thousands of dollars per day in downtime, and I'd casually mentioned a solution over dinner that could fix it in hours rather than weeks. He'd listened with that polite, dismissive smile he reserved for my suggestions, then hired an expensive consulting firm that implemented the exact same solution I'd proposed, except it took them 2 weeks and cost $20,000. The pattern had been there all along, but I'd been too focused on keeping the peace to recognize how destructive it was becoming. Marcus would come home frustrated about workplace challenges, and I'd offer insights based on my technical background and business experience, only to watch him dismiss my ideas as overly simplified or naive. Then, weeks later, he'd return home excited about some breakthrough solution that his team or an outside consultant had developed. Solutions that were often identical to what I'd suggested, but packaged in more expensive, professional presentations. It wasn't just that he was missing opportunities to benefit from my expertise. He was training both of us to believe that my contributions weren't valuable enough to take seriously, creating a cycle where I offered less, and he expected even less. The lost opportunities weren't just professional. They were personal and relational in ways that had shaped our entire family dynamic. I thought about all the times I'd held back from sharing my opinions about financial decisions, investment strategies, or major purchases because I'd learned that Marcus valued confidence over accuracy, and my careful, analytical approach often came across as hesitation rather than thoroughness. Our children had grown up watching their father make pronouncements while their mother offered gentle suggestions that were rarely implemented, teaching them that authority and expertise were masculine traits, while support and accommodation were feminine ones. I realized that by accepting this dynamic, I'd been modeling a version of partnership that I didn't want Emma and Jake to replicate in their own future relationships. But perhaps the most painful realization was understanding how much Marcus had lost by not recognizing who I really was, even though he'd never see it that way himself. He'd spent years paying consultants for advice that his wife could have provided for free, networking desperately to make business connections while ignoring the professional relationships I'd been building in our own community. His career could have advanced faster, his business decisions could have been more informed, and his professional reputation could have been enhanced by acknowledging and utilizing my expertise, rather than treating it as irrelevant background noise. Instead, he'd chosen to see me as a limitation rather than an asset, and now he was going to discover exactly how much that perspective had cost him. The strangest part was realizing that even now, even after seeing the evidence of my professional success laid out in legal documents, Marcus still didn't fully understand what he'd been missing all these years. During our brief interactions at custody exchanges, I could see him looking at me with confusion and frustration, as if I'd somehow deceived him by being more capable than he'd realized. He couldn't grasp that the problem wasn't my deception. It was his inability to see past his own assumptions about who deserved to be taken seriously and who didn't. The opportunities had always been there, waiting for someone to recognize them. But recognition requires a kind of respect that Marcus had never been willing to offer to the woman who shared his bed and raised his children. The final hearing took place on a gray December morning that felt heavy with the weight of everything that was about to be resolved one way or another. I arrived at the courthouse early, carrying the same leather briefcase but feeling like a completely different person than the woman who'd first walked into that courtroom months earlier. This time, Marcus and Mr. Davidson were waiting for me with expressions that showed they finally understood they weren't dealing with an amateur. They looked like chess players who'd realized too late that their opponent had been thinking several moves ahead all along. The judge entered with a stack of documents that I knew represented not just the end of my marriage, but the beginning of a new chapter where I'd finally be recognized for my true capabilities and contributions. Judge Williams began by acknowledging that this had become one of the most complex and revealing divorce cases she'd presided over in her 15 years on the bench. She noted that the evidence presented had challenged fundamental assumptions about the roles and contributions of both parties, and that the final settlement would need to reflect the actual financial and professional reality rather than the assumptions that had initially been presented. I sat quietly, maintaining the calm demeanor I'd practiced, while Marcus shifted uncomfortably as the judge reviewed the documentation of my business success, my financial contributions, and the systematic pattern of unacknowledged partnership that had characterized our marriage. This was the moment when years of being underestimated would finally be transformed into legal recognition and financial justice. The settlement terms that Judge Williams announced were beyond anything I'd dared to hope for when this process began. Not only would I receive 50% of all marital assets, including Marcus's business investments and retirement accounts, but the judge also ruled that my consulting business constituted separate property that I would retain entirely. More importantly, she granted me primary custody of Emma and Jake, recognizing that I'd been their primary caregiver and that my stable business income demonstrated my ability to provide for their needs independently. Marcus would pay child support based on his actual income, not the reduced amount his lawyer had tried to claim, and he'd have supervised visitation until he could demonstrate that he understood and respected my role as the children's primary parent. But the moment that gave me the greatest satisfaction wasn't about money or custody. It was when Judge Williams addressed Marcus directly about his failure to acknowledge my contributions to the marriage and his attempts to minimize my professional achievements during the proceedings. She spoke about the importance of recognizing and valuing all forms of contribution in a partnership, and noted that his inability to see my capabilities had ultimately been detrimental not just to our marriage, but to his own interests as well. Marcus sat there receiving what amounted to a judicial lecture about respect and partnership, and for the first time in our entire relationship, someone in authority was holding him accountable for treating me as less than an equal partner. As we gathered our papers and prepared to leave the courtroom for the final time, I caught Marcus's eye and saw something I'd never seen before. Not anger or frustration, but a kind of bewildered recognition, as if he was finally understanding who he'd been married to all along. Mr. Davidson looked exhausted and defeated, probably wondering how he'd so completely misread the situation and underestimated his opponent. But I felt energized and clear-headed in a way I hadn't experienced since my college days, when I'd solved complex problems and received recognition for my intelligence and creativity. The woman who'd been hiding in plain sight for over a decade had finally stepped fully into the light, and she'd proven that sometimes the most powerful victory comes not from destroying your opponent, but from simply refusing to let them define who you are anymore. The weeks following the court victory brought a satisfaction that was deeper and more complex than simple vindication. It was the profound pleasure of watching people who'd underestimated me finally understand the true cost of their assumptions. Marcus had to explain to his colleagues why his simple housewife was now recognized as an equal business professional who'd been contributing to his success all along, and I heard through mutual friends that these conversations were deeply humbling for him. His new girlfriend, Jennifer, who'd been so confident about upgrading from me, suddenly found herself dating a man whose financial situation was much less impressive than she'd believed, and whose ex-wife wasn't the pushover she'd expected to deal with in co-parenting situations. The divorce settlement had revealed that much of what looked like Marcus's individual success had actually been the result of an unacknowledged partnership, and now everyone could see the mathematical proof of my contributions. If you've ever experienced that moment when people who dismissed you finally had to face the truth about your capabilities, please subscribe and hit that like button, because there's something powerful about being vindicated by facts rather than just feeling. Have you ever watched someone who underestimated you struggle to adjust their perception of reality? I'd love to hear your stories in the comments because these moments of recognition can be incredibly healing. The most satisfying aspect wasn't watching Marcus struggle with his reduced circumstances, but seeing how differently people treated me once they understood who I'd been all along. Neighbors who'd barely acknowledged me during school pickup now sought out my advice about their own business challenges and introduced me to their networks as Sarah, the consultant we've all been hearing about. Social events that had once felt awkward and diminished became opportunities for meaningful professional conversations where people valued my insights and expertise. I wasn't getting revenge by hurting anyone. I was getting justice by finally being seen and treated with the respect I'd always deserved, but had been too polite or too tired to demand. The children's reaction to this transformation was perhaps the most rewarding part of the entire experience, because they began to understand their mother in ways they'd never been encouraged to before. Emma started asking me about my work projects and showing genuine pride when she learned about my professional achievements, while Jake began introducing me to his friends as my mom who runs her own company, rather than just my mom. They could see that the dynamic in our household had shifted from me being the person who managed everything quietly to being someone whose opinions were sought out, whose expertise was acknowledged, and whose success was celebrated rather than minimized. This wasn't just about winning a legal battle. It was about modeling for my children what it looked like when someone refused to accept being treated as less than they were worth. But the real revenge, if you want to call it that, was much more subtle and long-lasting than any dramatic confrontation could have been. Marcus now had to navigate single parenthood during his custody weekends, discovering how much work I'd been doing invisibly for over a decade. His business colleagues knew that his former wife was a successful consultant in her own right, making his previous dismissive comments about my domestic concerns look petty and short-sighted. Most importantly, I'd proven to myself and to everyone who'd been watching that the woman they'd underestimated had always been capable of extraordinary things. She'd just been waiting for the right moment to stop hiding her light under someone else's bushel. The sweetest revenge was simply living as my authentic, successful self and watching the world adjust to a reality where I was no longer willing to be invisible. The transformation that followed wasn't just external. It was a fundamental shift in how I saw myself and how I moved through the world with a confidence I'd forgotten I possessed. For the first time in over a decade, I woke up each morning excited about the day ahead, rather than anxious about managing everyone else's needs before addressing my own. My consulting business expanded rapidly as word spread about my capabilities, and I found myself working with clients who challenged me intellectually and appreciated my problem-solving skills in ways that reminded me why I'd loved this type of work in the first place. The woman who'd been hiding behind the role of supportive wife discovered that she'd been accumulating knowledge, skills, and insights all along. She just needed permission to use them publicly and receive credit for her contributions. The personal growth went deeper than professional success, though that was certainly gratifying after years of having my capabilities questioned or ignored. I began to recognize patterns in my behavior that had been shaped by constantly accommodating Marcus's need to be the primary authority figure in our relationship, and I worked on unlearning those reflexes that had made me smaller than I actually was. Simple things like expressing strong opinions without apologizing first, making decisions without seeking unnecessary approval, and taking up space in conversations without worrying about being seen as aggressive or pushy. These became daily practices in reclaiming my authentic personality. It was like watching myself come back to life after years of holding my breath. The relationship with my children deepened in ways I hadn't expected, because they were seeing me as a complete person, rather than just as their caretaker and household manager. Emma began asking for my advice about school projects and career planning, recognizing that her mother had professional expertise worth consulting. Jake started showing off about my mom's company to his friends, displaying a pride in my achievements that Marcus had never modeled during our marriage. They were learning what a healthy relationship looked like by watching me interact with business partners who treated me as an equal, and they were developing respect for competence and intelligence regardless of gender in ways that would benefit their own future relationships. Perhaps most importantly, I was rediscovering parts of my personality that had been dormant for so long I'd almost forgotten they existed. The quick wit that used to make people laugh in college conversations, the analytical thinking that could cut through complex problems to find elegant solutions, the natural leadership abilities that emerged when I was working with teams who respected my expertise, all of these aspects of myself were coming back online as I stepped into environments where they were valued rather than seen as threatening to someone else's ego. I felt like an artist who'd been forced to paint in shades of gray for years and was finally being handed a full palette of colors again. The victory wasn't just that I'd won the legal battle or achieved financial independence. It was that I'd reclaimed my right to exist as my full, authentic self without apology or diminishment. Marcus had spent years convincing me that my capabilities were less important than his comfort, that my opinions mattered less than his confidence, and that my contributions were secondary to his achievements. But standing in that courtroom, presenting evidence of my professional success to people who could see my worth clearly, I'd broken free from those limitations permanently. The woman who emerged from that experience wasn't just financially secure and legally vindicated. She was someone who would never again allow herself to be defined by other people's inability to recognize her value, and that transformation was worth more than any settlement amount could ever be. 6 months after the final court hearing, I was sitting in my own office, not a corner of the kitchen table or a makeshift workspace in the spare bedroom, but an actual professional office space that I'd leased for SM Consulting Solutions, when I received a call that perfectly encapsulated how completely my life had changed. The caller was Margaret Chen, the CEO of a major regional corporation who'd heard about my work through the business network I'd been building, and she wanted to hire my company to lead a complete digital transformation project for her organization. As she described the scope of the work and the level of responsibility involved, I realized that this was exactly the kind of challenge I'd been preparing for my entire adult life, even during those years when I thought I was just playing with computers, while everyone else was living their real professional lives. If you've made it this far in my story, please subscribe and hit that like button, because what I'm about to tell you about the power of transformation might be exactly what you need to hear today. Have you ever wondered what your life could look like if you stopped accepting other people's limitations on your potential? I hope my journey inspires you to explore that question for yourself. The professional transformation was remarkable, but the personal changes were even more profound, in ways that touched every aspect of my daily existence. I no longer woke up with that familiar knot of anxiety in my stomach, wondering how I'd manage everyone else's needs while ignoring my own. Instead, I started each day with a sense of purpose and excitement about the problems I'd get to solve and the people I'd get to help through my work. My relationship with Emma and Jake had evolved into something much richer than traditional parent-child dynamics. They saw me as someone who'd overcome significant challenges and built something meaningful from her own efforts, which gave them a model for resilience and self-advocacy that no amount of lecturing could have provided. The way I moved through social situations changed completely as well, because I was no longer the woman who stood quietly in corners at business events while her husband networked and took center stage. Now I was the person other professionals sought out for conversations about industry trends, technological solutions, and business strategies. Marcus and I would occasionally end up at the same community events, and the contrast between our positions was striking. He'd become someone people interacted with politely but briefly, while I was surrounded by colleagues and clients who genuinely valued my insights and expertise. It wasn't that I was trying to overshadow him, but simply that I was finally operating at my full capacity instead of dimming my light to make others more comfortable. The ripple effects extended into relationships I never would have expected to be impacted by my transformation. Old friends who'd known me during my marriage began reaching out to share their own stories of feeling undervalued or overlooked in their relationships, and I found myself becoming someone people came to for advice about recognizing their own worth and standing up for themselves. My mother, who'd always worried that I was too accommodating for my own good, started calling more frequently just to hear the confidence in my voice and celebrate the achievements I was sharing with the family. Even Emma's teachers commented on how much more assured and articulate she'd become in class, apparently absorbing lessons about self-advocacy and personal worth from watching her mother's transformation. Looking back now, I can see that the courtroom revelation wasn't really the beginning of my transformation. It was just the moment when years of hidden growth finally became visible to the outside world. The real change had been happening gradually, through every late-night consulting project that challenged my problem-solving skills. Every client interaction that reminded me I had valuable expertise to offer. Every small step I took toward building something that was entirely my own creation. The woman who stood up in that courtroom and announced her true identity had been developing her capabilities and confidence for years. She'd just been waiting for the right moment to step fully into the light and claim the recognition she'd always deserved but had been too polite, too tired, or too afraid to demand. As I close this chapter of my story and look toward the future I'm building for myself and my children, I want you to understand something important. The power to transform your life has always been inside you, waiting for the moment when you decide you're tired of being underestimated, undervalued, or invisible. My journey from overlooked housewife to recognized business professional wasn't about becoming someone new. It was about finally having the courage to show the world who I'd always been underneath all the assumptions and limitations that others had placed on me. The capabilities, the intelligence, the strength, and the potential for greatness were always there. I just needed to stop accepting other people's narrow definitions of who I was supposed to be and start living as my authentic, powerful self. The courtroom revelation was dramatic and satisfying, but the real victory was much quieter and more lasting. It was the daily choice to operate at my full capacity instead of shrinking myself to fit into spaces that were too small for my abilities. Every morning when I wake up excited about the challenges ahead, every conversation where my expertise is valued and sought out, every moment when my children see their mother as someone who overcame obstacles and built something meaningful from her own efforts, these are the true rewards of refusing to accept being treated as less than I was worth. The woman sitting in that corner of the courtroom wasn't just fighting for a fair divorce settlement. She was reclaiming her right to exist as her complete, brilliant, capable self. So let me ask you this. What would your life look like if you stopped accepting other people's limitations on your potential? What dreams have you put aside because someone convinced you they weren't realistic or important? What capabilities do you possess that you've been hiding because you were taught to be humble, accommodating, or supportive at the expense of your own growth and recognition? After hearing my story, I hope you'll start asking yourself these questions seriously, because the world needs what you have to offer, and you deserve to be seen and celebrated for who you truly are beneath all the roles and expectations that others have placed on you. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever felt invisible or underestimated, if you're ready to stop dimming your light to make others more comfortable, then I want you to know that your transformation is possible too. It might not happen in a dramatic courtroom revelation like mine did, but it can happen through the daily choice to honor your own capabilities, value your own contributions, and refuse to accept being treated as less than you deserve. The person you're meant to become is already inside you. She's just waiting for permission to step into the light and show the world what she can accomplish when she's finally free to operate at her full potential. Make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications, because in my next video, I'll be sharing the story of what happened when Marcus tried to reconcile after realizing what he'd lost, and how I handled his attempts to convince me that we could start over with a better understanding of each other's worth. Trust me, his reaction to my new life and success was even more revealing than his behavior during our marriage. And the lessons from that experience will help anyone who's dealing with people who only value you after they've lost access to your contributions.